In the previous two lessons, we learned why each human person is endowed by God with inherent dignity. We learned that God's plan for humanity included marriage between a man and a woman, and that children are the fruit of that exclusive union. This design was for the good of the human person, the family, and society. However, the sin of racism fed the poisonous lie that Black people were inferior to whites, and as many white people engorged themselves on this lie, they enacted laws that successfully indoctrinated and imposed the lie on the American population. Black enslaved persons, by law and custom, were deprived of the blessings of family life, marriage, monogamy, and the conditions for flourishing as God had intended. The enslaved person had no rights under the law and suffered in ways that are deeply traumatizing. They were not treated as humans. The grave injury to the common good and to the moral fabric of society is undeniable. The evil of racism was and is a direct assault against God's word and his plan for the human person. In this lesson, we examine the life of the newly freed Black person and examine the changes in societal attitudes, laws, and practices. With the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, the former slaveholding states remained a part of the Union and Black people were freed. With their new freedom, our country was finally rid of chattel slavery. Blacks and whites were integrated into the post-Civil War society, right? One may recall the Gettysburg Address, in which President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. He closed the address stating, "The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth." This new birth of freedom would include, of course, the full abolition of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment. African Americans were also granted full citizenship by the 14th Amendment, and African American men were given the right to vote by the 15th Amendment. Douglas Blackmun writes in Slavery by Another Name, in 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, the one federal law forcing whites to comply with the provisions of the 14th and 15th Amendments, awarding voting and legal rights to Blacks, could be enforced only under the most rare circumstances. Civil rights was a local, not federal issue, the court found. The effect was to open the floodgates for laws throughout the South, specifically aimed at eliminating those new rights for former slaves and their descendants. This decision was handed down on 5 consolidated civil rights cases: United States versus Stanley, United States versus Ryan, United States versus Nichols, United States versus Singleton, and Robinson and White versus Memphis and the Charleston Railroad Company. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment had immediately established a just moral order in society? The truth is that centuries of the moral rationalization for slavery corrupted the minds of whites. Blackmun explains, "The view of slaves as the essential proof of white man's royal status became as fundamental to whites' perception of America as the concept of liberty itself. This was the paradox of the post-Civil War South. Recognition of freed slaves as full humans appeared to most white Southerners not as an extension of liberty, but as a violation of it, and as a challenge to their legitimacy of the definition of what it was to be white." Meanwhile, the free Blacks were hopeful and ready to claim land the Freedmen's Bureau, a bureau created by Congress to aid freed Black persons, had the power to give them. New laws empowered the Bureau to divide confiscated land and provide up to 40 acres of land to the emancipated. After a 3-year period, the freedmen would be eligible to purchase the land. Many formerly enslaved Black persons, spurred by rumor and hope, acquired boundary markers to designate the soon-to-be-given land. General Sherman had already seized 400,000 acres in 1865 and set it aside for the freedmen under Special Field Order 15. Tragically, President Andrew Johnson withdrew the order to placate the South. The freed people never received their land. Some of the newly emancipated sought redress for other violations in court. Blackman relates a shocking episode from Alabama. In Greene County, hundreds of former slaves filed suit against white landowners in 1868, demanding that the former slave masters be compelled to pay wages earned during the prior season's work. Whites responded by burning down the courthouse, and with it, all 1,800 lawsuits filed by the freedmen. In order to subvert Black people's new freedoms and restore antebellum relations, laws were enacted to criminalize Black people. For example, it was a crime to be unemployed, but these laws were only enforced against Black people. These legal traps led to indiscriminate arrests of Black men. The courts levied fines in amounts these men could not pay. White landowners then stepped in to pay the fine in exchange for the freedmen to labor by contract under the same conditions as slavery. The abuse of the legal system to re-enslave Black people is as unconscionable as it is undeniable. As such, thousands of men were coerced into this type of forced labor and sent to mines, factories, and fields under horrendous conditions, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Counties across the southern United States made money by arresting free Black men and accepting payment from businesses to use them as forced laborers. Deputy sheriffs would track down any forced laborers who tried to escape. If they were caught, they would be subjected to severe punishments. John Hill, a former slave, gave an account of the severity of the punishment. They had dogs to trail them with, so they always got caught. And then the whipping boss beat them almost to death. It was awful to hear them hollering and begging for mercy. If they hollered, "Lord, have mercy," Marse Jim didn't hear them. But if they cried, "Marse Jim, have mercy," then he made them stop the beating. He say, "The Lord ruled heaven, but Jim Smith ruled the earth." Blackman details some of the horrors of this labor arrangement. Survivors recounted to friends and relatives how slave miners labored under ghastly conditions, working in pools of putrid water that seeped out of the rock or leaked from equipment used to soften the coal. The seepage was contaminated by mineral residues and the prisoners' own body waste, but was often the only water available to drink. The contaminated seepage frequently triggered waves of dysentery. In Texas, where prisoners were chained at the neck and held in boxcars at night, working from sunup to sundown, they survived on food buzzards would not eat and suffered sadistic punishments. Hundreds of men charged with petty crimes were simply worked to death and then buried unceremoniously wherever they fell. To escape that fate, Texas convicts mimicked the desperate tactics of slaves before them, slicing their heel strings, hacking off their hands, or gouging out their eyes. In some instances, white landowners sought out Black women as well, with the clear implication that they were seized for sexual services. A Black woman named Mattie Turner was held on a farm indefinitely, falsely accused of prostitution. The implication was clear that Turner was held for the sexual exploitation of the farm. The report Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror, records the opening statement from the Alabama Constitutional Convention in 1901. John B. Knox, president of the convention, spoke these words. And what is it that we want to do? Why, it is within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution to establish white supremacy in this state. As late as 1942, FBI agents raided a Texas farm and found a case of involuntary servitude. President Truman's Committee on Civil Rights called for a strengthening of the Slavery Kidnapping Act, which had first been passed in 1866, but almost never enforced. According to Blackman, in 1951, Congress passed even more explicit laws to make any form of slavery in the United States indisputably a crime. While I should not have been surprised by the gross abuse of power by the legal system, by the sheriffs, businessmen, judges, and county and state governments, and the Supreme Court, I was. Researching this information has been emotionally and spiritually draining for me. To read about centuries of evil and intentional decisions to harm Black persons, even when they were supposed to be free and protected by constitutional amendments, it's hard to describe. The snares of the devil had many souls in his grip. Their minds were just so crippled by racism, and their hearts were as hard as concrete. These people were so invested in maintaining a racial hierarchy that they not only abused freed Black persons, as previously described, but also invented myths about them. For example, even though the legal system was thoroughly corrupt regarding Black people in order to force them into neo-slavery, they used the records of these trumped-up charges as evidence of the innate criminality of Black people. They justified raping and forcing Black women into sexual slavery by promoting the lie that they were sexually available and promiscuous. Meanwhile, they told myths about themselves too. For every good quality they boasted about themselves, they positioned the Black person as the opposite. There were so many ways the white populace tried to reinforce white supremacy. The following are a few sources and detailed explanations in the various tactics used to subjugate Black people. Grant, by famed historian Ron Chernow, captures the postbellum terror perpetuated against African Americans who dared to exercise their newly established rights. Despite what were initially heroic efforts to protect African Americans in the southern states, for example, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1868 and the establishment of the Justice Department to prosecute such crimes, political support to protect African Americans evaporated within the decade. The Strange Career of Jim Crow by C. Van Woodward is a landmark history documenting the collapse of Reconstruction and the descent of the American South into a long, relentless racial nightmare. Timothy Tyson, in his article, The Ghosts of 1898, Wilmington's Race Riot and the Rise of White Supremacy, speaks of the interracial coalition that won many seats in the North Carolina government in 1894 and 1896. Led by Charles B. Aycock, a future governor of North Carolina, white supremacists sought to regain power by destroying the coalition. They used racist appeals to persuade the white populace that they were in jeopardy. Supremacists claimed they would end Negro domination and restore a traditional way of life. Their propaganda included spreading myths that Black sexuality was beastly and insatiable, and a threat to white women's innocence. In response to a pro-lynching speech, Alexander Manley, the Black editor of Wilmington's only Black newspaper, The Daily Record, published an editorial that flat out challenged and pointed out the hypocrisy of whites' attitudes toward interracial sex. On November 10th, 1898, a white mob of about 2,000 descended on the building where the Daily Record was published and burned it down. Violence spread to the streets and the mob attacked the Black section of town. Tyson writes, "While the violence raged, white leaders launched a coup d'etat, forcing the mayor, the board of aldermen, and the police chief to resign at gunpoint. By 4 p.m. that day, Alfred Waddell, a former four-term congressman and Confederate soldier and a noted white supremacist, was Wilmington's mayor. Still, they were not done. The white mob gathered at the city jail to watch soldiers with fixed bayonets march leaders of the interracial coalition to the train station, banishing at least 21 successful Blacks and their white allies from the city. In the history of the United States, this is the only successful coup. Pogroms and ethnic cleansing occurred in Colfax, Louisiana, Atlanta, Georgia, Elaine, Arkansas, Rosewood, Florida, and many more cities across the United States. The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre that destroyed Black Wall Street occurred less than a quarter of a century after the Wilmington, North Carolina coup. Jealousy and white supremacy spurred the violence against the wealthy Black community under the cover of an inflammatory news report of a Black man encountering a white woman in an elevator. The details vary as to what happened, but the man was arrested. A white mob entered the Black community and stole, destroyed, and damaged property. Civil authorities deputized men who were supposed to stop the violence, but instead, they participated in it. The public authorities gave guns and ammunition to the mob. Estimated deaths are as high as 300, mostly Black people. No one has ever been held accountable for the death and destruction of Black Wall Street. C. Van Woodard and other authors document sundown towns where African Americans were barred by force, threat of death, law, and/or custom from living in these towns, and were required to exit the towns by sundown. Other means of keeping towns all white were restrictive covenants. One homeowner in Tyler, Texas, modern-day Tyler, Texas, found the following restriction in her documents. No lot shall be sold to or occupied by anyone of African blood or descent, provided, however, that this shall not prohibit the occupancy of any house servant by servants of African descent or blood. The above restrictions shall run with and be a part of the title to said subdivision. Witness my hand this 5th day of September, A.D. 1959. Another means of keeping towns all white and keeping Black people fearful and controlled were lynchings. Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America by Richard Allen is a searing, eye-opening look at the practice of lynching. The images are revolting. They should make you sick in your heart and soul. It is not unlike viewing aborted children. These images were saved, shared, and even sent in the regular mail, underscoring how commonplace this ugly and evil sin had become in our country. A lynching was a pre-planned affair where families with children attended and later posed with the mangled body of the victim for photographers. Body parts of the victim were seized by the crowd and kept as family relics. In order to underscore the grave evil and barbarity of lynching, I will tell you about the 1918 lynching of Mrs. Mary Turner on Sunday, the Lord's Day, in Georgia. Her husband had been lynched by a mob. She stated if she knew anyone who had lynched her husband, she would take their names to authorities and have warrants issued against them and have them punished in court. According to Walter F. White's investigative report of Brooks and Lowndes County, Georgia, for the NAACP titled The Work of a Mob, he describes, at the time she was lynched, Mary Turner was in her 8th month of pregnancy. The delicate state of her health, 1 month or less previous to delivery, may be imagined, but this fact had no effect on the tender feelings of the mob. Her ankles were tied together and she was hung to the tree, head downward. Gasoline and oil from the automobiles were thrown on her clothing, and while she writhed in agony and the mob howled in glee, a match was applied, and her clothes burned from her person. When this had been done, and while she was yet alive, a knife, evidently one such as used in splitting hogs, was taken, and the woman's abdomen was cut open, the unborn babe falling from her womb to the ground. The infant, prematurely born, gave 2 feeble cries, and then its head was crushed by a member of the mob with his heel. Hundreds of bullets were then fired into the body of the woman, now mercifully dead, and the work was over. Mary Turner was one of 11 Black people lynched over a 7-day period in retaliation for the killing of a white landowner during the month of May, Mary's Month, in 1918. Black people fled the area because of the lynchings. Notwithstanding migrations to northern and western states for employment and housing, Jim Crow segregation and racial discrimination followed. Richard Rothstein, in his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, traces the origins of more recent racial inequities, such as housing segregation. Rothstein highlights how the government and businesses deliberately expanded racial segregation before and after World War II. Sadly, it is a history largely forgotten. Rothstein states, half a century ago, the truth of de jure segregation was well known, but since then, we have suppressed our historical memory and soothed ourselves into believing that it all happened by accident or by misguided private prejudice. Although most of these policies are now off the books, they have never been remedied, and their effects endure. He continues, we've developed other euphemisms too, so that polite company doesn't have to confront our history of racial exclusion. These insights are notable because we have also developed false narratives disguised as history to insulate ourselves from painful history. Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present, by Harriet A. Washington, is groundbreaking in documenting the cruel and inhumane exploitation of African Americans. The accounts in her book are hair-raising, from cruel experimentation on the enslaved to kooky racist theories linking skull size to a lack of intelligence, to the 40-year Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where the U.S. government did not treat participants suffering from syphilis and concealed that fact. Medical Apartheid reveals the racist myths and practices that impact Black healthcare. Today, it seems that even the civil rights movement and its lessons have now been romanticized or forgotten. One would do well to view Eyes on the Prize, which is the definitive documentary about the civil rights movement. The documentary recounts the history of the movement in a visually powerful way. Even so, many have now abandoned the victories and lessons of the civil rights movement and embraced an uncharitable, if not unjust, ahistorical worldview that cynically rejects claims to racial justice. Oh, how many lashes did our Savior bear for these evils? The free choice to embrace the sin of racism is a grave wound on our common humanity. It distorts souls and blinds the eyes so one cannot comprehend what freedom and goodness mean. Christians even twisted scripture to justify these abominable practices and customs. Racism requires a purification, perhaps an exorcism of the mind. Racism deforms the human heart. Laws alone simply cannot convert hearts. Our church has the means to help facilitate conversions. What role did it play in the experience of Black Catholics? In our next lesson, we will examine at a high level the experience of Black people with the Catholic Church.